Podcast series. In this enlightening episode, Bob and Braden discuss the effects of the spill on drinking water, the watershed, and the potential for long-term environmental consequences. They also delve into possible solutions and remediation strategies for restoring the region's water resources.
Welcome back to the Restore-A-Thon. I'm joined now with Bob Bowcock, who is a water expert from the eastpalestine.com group. Bob, tell us about yourself. What is your background and how have you kind of connected in with this group?
Sure. I like to equate myself a little bit to the Safe Drinking Water Act in that I actually started in the water industry in 1979 reading water meters on roller skates here in Southern California. So it gave me an opportunity to literally work from the ground floor up. Became a utility director, worked for Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, parlayed that into an opportunity to have a national practice doing environmental compliance work around the country. Served here in Southern California as a water master reporting to the court, where I had the opportunity some 30 years ago to meet Erin Brockovich and her team. And that worked me into an opportunity to travel around the country. We've responded to over 500 East Palestine type, disasters that have impacted the drinking water systems of those communities.
Wow, 500. That's a remarkable career, but not one that we should be excited about,
Yeah,
unfortunately. So is that the connection from South California to the Ohio spill, the Erin Brockovich link, or did you just come out in your own way about this?
Yeah, no. What happened was Erin social media inquiries. She gets probably somewhere on the neighborhood of on a normal week, if there is such a thing, over 5,000 emails. Direct messages through Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and people always asking for requests. When a situation like East Palestine happens, literally, by 9:30 that Friday night in February, we had several hundred emails specifically from the town. Erin, there's been a disaster here. Please help. That was compounded by the morning when relatives of the people from East Palestine started emailing in, Erin, you've got to help these people. And that went on and on and on. And by the time Sunday rolled around and they torched the vinyl chloride in that ditch, we were over 25,000 requests to come out and find out what was going on and help. Initially it was our opportunity to help educate the community. It's very divisive in that there's information coming from multiple sources. Things were unfolding in real time. And so we were just trying to bring some stability, some calmness, some understanding of what was actually going on in order to allow the individuals impacted to actually protect themselves instead of be placated by government officials who had no clue what they were doing.
Yeah, we had a couple of guests join us for our first episode where we heard a little bit about that sort of uncertainty and lack of transparency and so on, which I imagine you probably see in a lot of the communities that you go to. So I'm curious from your perspective, you have obviously the water expertise. How bad is this hazardous spill for the watershed? Is it a really serious thing? Do you see this sort of on a spectrum with the other types of community hazardous spills you've experienced? Like, where does it fit into that, and what does it kind of look like?
Somebody asked me that question early on when we became involved with East Palestine, and they said, hey, Bob, can you kind of explain, we know you've been involved in so many of these types of cases, let's say that the Gulf oil spill was a 10. and where on the spectrum, the Exxon Valdez was an 8. Where on the spectrum of 1 to 10 would you put East Palestine? I said, I think it started out about a 2 that the responders turned into a 10. And the reason for that was all the different activities that they engaged in actually compounded the problem. Time will eventually cure a lot of the immediate impacts associated with spills like this. I mean, the vinyl chloride and the other chemicals of concern, the vinyl chloride was basically evaporated into the air almost instantaneously. But the remaining chemicals are sitting in the Gulf of Mexico now. So it has a tendency to kind of flush itself out relatively quickly. But understanding what the local impact is, you keep using the term, how's the watershed impacted? We could be talking about the Ohio Valley watershed. We could be talking about the watershed that ultimately ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And how that's impacted is important to understand. The creeks and little streams in and around East Palestine will be impacted for many years. And people don't understand that when these spills occur, you have a groundwater surface water interface that is constantly allowing chemicals to be re-emitted back into the environment. Think of the area around the railroad tracks as a giant tea bag. And that tea bag of contamination is just sitting in there along the rail cars. And as it rains, it flushes it into the groundwater. The groundwater ultimately percolates into those creeks that ultimately percolate into the streams, into the rivers, and down into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's how you'll have this continuous impact on the watershed, both locally and throughout the watershed. And it's not just this particular derailment and chemical spill isolated in this one area, which is why you still see them hauling away dirt. You still see them pumping up groundwater, pumping up surface water, cleaning out the creeks. They could engage in that activity for many years. And while it looks good, and I applaud them for their efforts, it's a lot of televised placation. So
Okay. So what's the right thing to do if you actually are trying to, clean everything as fast as possible? How does that get done?
Well, one of the things that I've called for early on was a better understanding of the groundwater well situation. And this is true for East Palestine specifically, and it's true for almost all of our watersheds in that how many groundwater wells are in that community today? They don't have a database. They don't really know. There's never really been a survey. Nobody knows how deep they are. Nobody knows when the last time they were pumped. Nobody understands, is somebody watering an alfalfa field? Is somebody watering their backyard? What's the water being used for? Are there industrial wells in the area? There's no real good understanding of that in East Palestine or virtually in most of the watersheds in North America. And so what happens is people don't understand the distance water will travel underground. It went into the creek. Did it go under? They've flooded that park twice in the city. The East Palestine City Park's been flooded twice because of temporary dam structures that the contractors put in place so that they can aerate the water in the most crazy aeration plan I've ever seen in my life. But they are aerating it. They have dammed it, and it's flooded out twice. Well, all that contaminated water, it's going down wells and could go into sumps, could go down well shafts, could go all over. They don't know. And so it's both a preparation process, knowing what you don't know, and then going in and identifying where those wells are. Once you identify where those wells are, they start to put a ring around the contaminated site, extracting that water. It's going to have very low concentrations, if any at all yet, but you'll create a capture zone and you'll start capturing it. And then they should pump the hell out of that until that area becomes clean. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the vinyl chloride that's still there, and there is still vinyl chloride there as well as other chemicals, it's going to percolate through that tea bag, and it's going to get in pockets over here and pockets over there and pockets over here. And then as the hydrogeologic conditions change, it's going to migrate. And we're going to have soil vapor under houses and in basements, and it's going to move, and it's going to have all kinds of dynamic effect. I mean, look at the creeks. In the late fall, the groundwater is percolating out of the ground and into the creek and filling the creek and going down the Ohio River. When it's a time when the groundwater wells are creating a cone of depression off the river will actually take water from the river and go through the groundwater towards those wells. So you have to understand the surface water groundwater interface. You have to understand the depths and the conditions of your local aquifer, the surface water bodies. Are these creeks drains? Are they actually draining water off from from snowmelt, from rain, and sending it down the Ohio River? Or are they part of the conductivity with the groundwater? And so you need to have all that understood. Right now, they're just like, oh, here come the TV cameras. Go put a dump truck full of dirt out on the road, and let's do this and let's do that. And it's kind of this haphazard, unplanned response.
So have you actually been there at site and seen them do that? Like as
Oh
the,
yeah,
oh,
many
you
times,
have.
many
Wow.
times. I kind of it's sad, but when you do this so frequently, and God forbid this has any impact or offense to anyone in the community, but you see FEMA, Department of Transportation, the US EPA, all these federal agencies, after all the crap they took in the press, they're up on a hill in the city park. There's over 100 of them. It's been great for the local economy for the restaurants, because there's over 100 federal agents in town. It looks like the response, if you might not be old enough, but if you remember when they hit home where ET was living, and they put up all the tents and the tunnels and had all the federal agencies there, that's sort of what East Palestine looks like right now. They look. I'm an official. I have a clipboard.
And I'm
And that's our government's response. I have a clipboard, so I must be important.
right. Yeah, okay. So this is really an interesting take, right? Because if what we're seeing is, people coming from, Capitol Hill to take a photo op, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty and lack of information and lack of data, it seems like there's really kind of a missing link here, right? Like we're not actually set up for having these kinds of environmental problems. We don't expect them. And so when they happen, like it's literally whoever is there and the decisions that they happen to make. And, those may not be at all aware of what's actually going on, right? The whole, system of water flow that you just described, it's super complex. Like, what do we do about that?
It's really not that complex, and we actually do have the tools to do it right. It's unfortunate, EPA's taken it on the chin as an organization, and sadly, it's because EPA doesn't even implement what they're required to implement, and they don't even have a true local understanding of exactly what's going on. I mean, if you understand the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Act governs everything that's a discharge or that's on the surface, and there's a National Pollution Elimination Discharge System program. There's a lot. The federal government has more programs than understanding of the programs they actually have. And so the Safe Drinking Water Act, it has all these requirements and regulations. There are requirements at US EPA that these drinking water utilities, community drinking water systems, have source water protection plans. And then what happens on a local level, and these are all guidance documents. The EPA provides free software. They provide guidance. They'll hold your hand. They'll do your report. They'll help you understand all these things. And then they push those down onto the states. And there are 50 state Safe Drinking Water Act administrators in this country, one for every state. Half are in Department of Environmental Protection, half are in Department of Health. I will tell you, engineers and doctors don't think the same way. And so, I equate it to the fact that we have a Safe Drinking Water Act, we have a Clean Water Act, and we have 5,000 religions. And it's the implication of there is one way to apply the law, but we apply it 50 different ways. And then within those states, there are 50 different regions. And within those 50 different regions in those 50 different states, there's, 50,000 more different ways to apply the regulation, and that's where you're starting to see organizations like yourself that are taking up the clean water, work as far as the watershed management. You're starting to see drinking water NGOs pop up all over the place. And it's because the consumer's frustrated. I heard an advertisement, for $75 a month, we'll get you clean water in your drinking water home here in Los Angeles. Okay. I already pay more than $150 just to get the water to show up at my front door. Then I get the unit cost after that. And now they're advertising, for $75 more a month, I'll get safe, clean drinking water. It's funny. I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but something that happened just recently, all drinking water systems are required to have consumer confidence reports or water quality reports on an annual basis that they issue to all their consumers. It's a law and it's required. The EPA has prohibited the use of the phrase safe drinking water. You are no longer allowed to use Safe Drinking Water Act or safe drinking water as a phrase in your consumer confidence report, because it's, safe has implications that it might actually be safe. So you're not allowed to use that anymore. So there's the confidence level that the federal government has in our community drinking water system.
Restore-A-Thons are all about creating bioregional consciousness in action. Bioregions, also known as ecoregions, are areas of the planet grouped by similar plants, trees, insects, and animals. Step outside of geopolitics and into the Earth state with our community.
So, I mean, where does that leave us in this particular context, right? It sounds like, East Palestine response maybe didn't make the right choices. And that's certainly exacerbated the effect of the spill. What can we learn from that maybe for other communities?
Well, as I started out, we've done over 500 of these. There was and it's not just East Palestine. In West Virginia, the capital city, about 8 years ago, had a chemical spill from a large, 50,000 gallon petroleum product chemical, MCHM, smelled like black licorice. It was first discovered in the state capitol when a legislator went over to drink the water, and it smelled like black licorice. But anyway, this was a very toxic chemical, found its way into the river, found its way into the surface water treatment plant, out into the community drinking water system relatively quickly. You can look back. A capital city in North America was out of water for 6 weeks. Why didn't we learn from that response? There's been probably as many spills of chemical in the Ohio River Watershed in the last week as there have been train derailments. And for those of you watching train derailments, I think we have like 1.5 a day. It's kind of been crazy. I didn't focus on it as much as I did, prior to East Palestine, but this is not our first train derailment. We've had multiple train derailments. When I speak to the community, I remind them of the Lehigh train spill in Leroy, New York, which is just, straight up the Highway 80 there north of East Palestine. You go into Leroy, New York. In 1970, a train derailed with a similar chemical, TCE, as vinyl chloride, one rail car in 1970. By 1990, the EPA had considered it to become and put it on the list as a Superfund site. They basically went in and excavated 250 55-gallon drums of dirt, stuck them in the bushes. They all rusted out. Aaron and I responded to the community on another matter, asked what the rusted out 250 barrels of dirt were doing in the woods, found out there'd been a train derailment in 1970. This is in 2011. We said, what's going on? And they said, well, that's a Superfund site. Do you know when the remediation plan is due to the US EPA in Leroy, New York? August 2024. So how do you tell a community the EPA is here, they're here to help, they're engaged, they've issued a cleanup and abatement order, and all is well? Well, you just compare it to the other train spill in Leroy, New York, where their plans aren't even due till August 2024 in a train spill from 1970. So a lot of confidence there. So, and it's not the people in charge's faults, it's the system.
Okay, so let's start there. What would the system have to do differently not to produce a 54-year late abatement plan as like, the de facto approach?
Yeah, I'm a relatively conservative regulatory guy, if you can believe that, and it's and the reason that I am probably comes from the fact that I think what we need to do is we need to, before we institute any more rules or regulations in this country, we need to enforce the ones we have on the books first. If you look at some of these regulations and some of these laws, are you familiar with, so under the National Pollution Elimination Discharge System, we have point source, which is a wastewater treatment plant or a factory, has a point that we actually mark on a map and say, this point is allowed to discharge the following contaminants into this water body based on the following conditions. And that can go into the watershed, there's thousands of them on the Ohio River system. And they monitor everything from sediment to nutrients to all different kinds of constituents of concern in that area or reach of the river. And then they have non-point. And the non-point sources would be your city parks, your storm drains, a golf course, to where, a farm, to where water hits the surface and it runs off and it runs in. So that's a non-point source. Okay. We don't even catalog or manage our point source program properly in this country. Who's discharging? You've heard the Cape Fear River and the problem with DuPont and the perfluorinated, the Gen X that they were dumping into that river for decades. They're still dumping into that river for decades. There's a good example of the groundwater surface water interface. The DuPont property in the Cape Fear River, they're not point source discharging it anymore because they got caught. Now it's just leaking out of the groundwater into the river, probably for the rest of my life. So it's understanding, you know, we're talking about, in the news today, artificial intelligence is going to take over the world. I am not afraid of that because we can't even count how many point source permits we have in this country properly.
It's funny because
So maybe I want the artificial intelligence guy to figure that out because it's not that hard, but they just won't do it.
Why do you think that is?
It's different region by region, and it's unfortunate and it's sad. Your colleagues sitting there in the Bay, in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay, walk the edge of that thing if you want and see the pollution and see the in probably one of the most environmentally sensitive places on the earth, and certainly here in the United States, and they're still getting away with it. It's we probably have 50 NGOs that are concerned about those types of things, and quite frankly, our NGOs are actually a huge, the non-governmental organizations, the Riverkeeper, the Water Keeper, Clean Water Action, Environmental Working Group, NRDC, all those guys. There are people within those organizations that have more information than the government, and quite frankly, they have great rapport and work with the government, trying to get them to do the right thing. Like Erin and I. I mean, Erin and I, we can't be everywhere all the time, which, she went into a pretty long era of frustration there and, wrote Superman's not coming. It's going to be up to you, which is why we say the consumer is becoming the regulator. And the consumer can become the regulator on the clean water action side, or on the clean water regulation side, the discharge, just as much as they can on the surface water side. And in fact, or the drinking water side. And in fact, they will have a better impact on safe drinking water if they can stop the discharge of illegal pollutants. So I understand that this is a watershed concerned organization. So it's about understanding and getting that. Pollution doesn't have to be, tetramethyl ethyl death. Pollution can be corn syrup. Okay, corn syrup, a barge of corn syrup or ethanol going down the Ohio River turned sideways about 2 weeks ago and dumped. And everybody's like, it's just a little liquor, or it's just a little corn syrup. Do you know what that does to the environment? I mean, that food source, that liquor or that sugar spill will cause iron bacteria to go batshit crazy and start consuming things and knock the whole ecology of that watershed, that whole ecosystem out of whack. There will be a fish kill if it was the alcohol. If it's, corn syrup, the fish don't care, but all the other ecosystem is disrupted that will ultimately impact that fish. So you can have contamination that's sugar. Understand what's going up and down your river. Actually inventory your tanks. Where are the trains? What are the trains hauling? This information's all readily available. It's very frustrating when you hear the Department of Transportation. I don't care which administration, or the EPA. I don't care which administration. Any of these guys, they literally, they should have that, quite frankly, on their iPhone. I should be able to pick up my iPhone as an administrator of any federal agency and have the information at my fingertips within 5 minutes, or somebody's getting fired. They don't.
And that doesn't
It's
exist.
there.
Like, there's an app for that, or
No. Well, there should be. No, I'm being facetious. What I'm saying is after doing this for 40 years, you think we would have gotten better at that? No, but I'll tell you what, find me an app that shows a kid, dancing on a desk in school, and I'll create it and make $50 billion. But I can't come up with an app that can put together an Excel spreadsheet on NPDES permits. Come on, Excel's older than you.
It's remarkable how difficult it can be to build knowledge technologies, but that's a really good point, right? Like, we do have all of these new technologies coming online, like AI and knowledge tech and, lots of other things with satellites and sensors and whatever. Um, do you think that there's sort of a new frontier of tools that we could leverage to prevent pollution, to regulate it, to respond to it, to remediate it, like this whole kind of flow of challenge that you're describing?
The technology and the emerging technology is there. Do you know we have satellites right now watching the hazardous algae blooms in North America, all 22,000 of them last year? A hazardous algae bloom isn't just an algae bloom. An algae bloom where you go to the store and you see, a little bit of algae growing and, the ducks are eating it. That's cute algae. We have what they call hazardous algae blooms, which is a bacteria that engages in photosynthesis. And when dogs play in it, they're dead in about 15 minutes. They're called hazardous algae blooms. There were over 20,000 of those in North America. We watch them from a satellite. Do you know we watch groundwater subsidence? Basically where the earth goes down when we overpump groundwater wells. That's called subsidence. We watch that from a satellite. All the information's out there. It's just a question of how much money can I make off of it? This is where, it's the government actually owns a software program called FITS. It's a software program that does source water protection planning. Okay, they give it. If East Palestine water, which is a good rural community drinking water system, they're good operators there. It's very simple. There's 5 groundwater wells that pump to a central location and then distribute the water throughout the community. They do have some contaminants in it. They're working on getting that cleaned up. Not contaminants associated with the train derailment. They're putting the equipment in as though they have been contaminated, so that when it does hit, they're prepared. So they're doing the right thing. All this software for them is free. Since the 1980s, early 1980s, the US EPA has provided for free software for water distribution system modeling. And it was called EPA Net. You could go on, you could download it, you could put your pumping system in it. Do you know how many drinking water utilities in North America have implemented EPA Net, and or all the greater engineering firms in this country have put on, all kinds of bells and whistles on the free software the EPA gives away? They put a bunch of bells and whistles and color graphics on it, and then they sell it for $50,000 a day. But the EPA stuff's just as good, and it's free, been available since the 80s. And I'll tell you, there's less than 2% of drinking water utilities in North America actually use the hydraulic software that's free and available from US EPA today. The source water protection plans. The state of Ohio did East Palestine's 20 years ago. It's sitting on a shelf somewhere in Ohio, and nobody's even looked at it until the train derailment. And I said, why don't you look at your source water protection plan? And then they did, and they got real smart about it. But if you've read that, that's where the line in there says there is zero protection afforded the groundwater wells in East Palestine to contamination like this, because the groundwater is at 18 feet in sand. There's no protection. Those wells are going to suck that stuff up right away. So I guess my point, if I could say anything, is groups like yourselves, the consumer, one individual or an organization of 500, these tools are readily available. And if we use them, it's funny. It's like as soon as somebody in the community figures out how to use the FITS program at US EPA for source water protection, guess what? The water utility and the senior management in that community are going to get real smart on it, because Jim Bob over there knows how to use it. And so this is where the consumer can actually start have an impact on its watershed. Within the Ohio River watershed, the USGS, US Geological Society, has created a mapping program. NOAA has one for stormwater. EPA has FITS. I mean, there's all these overlapping. They don't even talk to each other. That's the funny part. There are probably, within the federal government, 50 different software programs to model surface water migration across the United States, and none of the agencies even talk to each other. They don't even share the information. And the reason I'm telling you that is because there's hydrologic units, HUCs they call them, in the USGS program, that I can model the water all the way back to the 7-Eleven gas station on a corner in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and where its stormwater goes, and tell you when that molecule of hydrocarbon will make its way into the Gulf of Mexico. The rainfall in Pennsylvania ends up in the Ohio River, which ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Mississippi, and on its way down. So we have the capability of doing that, but we can't even get the government agencies to talk to each other.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that sounds like another really big problem to solve and certainly essential. But if you are thinking about, sort of, if you're, I mean, let's go back to East Palestine, right? They have just had a
Sure.
10 water, water damage event. And this might, be an impact that goes on for multiple decades. What would you recommend for organizations or citizens or, people like us who are trying to bring new ideas into that space? What are the directions that we could begin to kind of think about?
Sure. So what would have to happen? It's funny, East Palestine specific. Um, where there's an opportunity here that I see starting to unfold is the fact that it happened on a state line that also separated the EPA regions. So Pennsylvania is in a different region than Ohio. So you've got two EPA regions kind of fighting over who's going to control the data and the information. And then you got two states with vastly different approaches to how this is going to get cleaned up. And then you got a very sophisticated railroad operator who publicly, because he's taken a lashing from Congress and the administration, wanting to do something. So here, East Palestine could actually be a location where we could have an example of how we dig ourselves out of this and do it right. And that goes back to creating this ring of extraction wells around the railroad yard to keep all the groundwater contained, on site, to keep it from spilling into pockets and creating future soil vapor intrusion. It's just a question of, does the railroad company want to do it right? Quite frankly, just as an outside observer with, inside knowledge and actually working with the community, if I was the railroad company, I'd want to go out and prove that we're one step ahead of the government. We do know, and that's the truth. Industry is always one step ahead of regulations. The reason industry participates in the regulatory setting process is because they love a line in the sand, because then they can just figure out how to get around it, which is why the railroad didn't break any laws here. They went right up to the edge of the law and never looked over. So they're going to always be in a situation where they didn't violate any laws, but they got right up to them. What they need to do is they need to take the information at the federal government level, at that Clean Water Act level, and literally impose it on themselves and stop this nonsense of taking, water down to Texas to deep well inject and dirt over to Indiana and dumping it at a hazardous waste landfill. It makes for great news at 5 o'clock, but you really didn't do anything. I don't know why they didn't attempt to clean and remediate that soil on site. I think that because of their reputation, they were too afraid to. But there were all kinds of technologies and techniques, and by God, they got 100 guys out there with clipboards. Let's get something done for real instead of putting on this show. I don't know whether you heard about, because of the smell, the chemical smell in town, which you can still smell. The EPA Region 3 guy from the Pennsylvania side came over and said, our equipment can't detect it at those levels, but the human nose has the ability to smell it at those levels. So the chemical smell is still there. So they've actually paid companies to go in and deodorize homes. Deodorize. I mean, it's the equivalent. They're buying a chemical. I've looked at the MSDS sheet myself. I've watched the videos of the guys actually spraying the chemicals. It's the equivalent of Febreze. It's deodorizer. And they go and they get the Home Depot backpack. They dress in the big space suit. They put the goggles and the mask on, and they're going in and spraying Febreze in these homes. That's not doing anything. And I'll bet you spent a lot of money on that. And it showed great on TV till somebody pulled the curtain back and said, you do know you're just spraying deodorizer. You're not actually cleaning these chemicals up. And so, it's understanding that. Those are what they can do on a go-forward basis. I would challenge them to step up and start doing the right thing. Now, on a debriefing basis or a post-mortem on this situation, There were a lot of things that we just didn't do from a regulatory agency perspective, from a railroad industry perspective. Why didn't the air relief valves work on those monochloride tanks? Why did they have to be breached and the burning that created all the dioxins have to occur? Why weren't they, was there a chemical additive in the vinyl chloride, as we've heard, that gummed them up? That might be illegal. Was there a failure to maintain those? That might be illegal. When I'm talking illegal, I mean criminal violations. There are some things to be looking at here when it comes to that. But as far as environmental regulation, our ability to respond, do we have the tools? Do we have the knowledge? We probably have excessive knowledge on how to deal with this. They're just choosing to do everything wrong. And it's a choice.
Ready to make a difference? Be part of the action. Go to www.restore-A-Thon.com and click Restore with Us button to join our Discord today.
I will definitely attest to the challenge of getting multiple stakeholders with different kinds of religions, as you say, to talk across the aisle and understand each other.
Sure.
And I wonder, if some of that is like communication challenges, or like, the problem of looking at the world in a different way and maybe not necessarily seeing eye to eye. But, on a more environmental level, what about, so, we also heard from another guest who shared about sort of natural techniques for actually cleaning the environmental spill. So we're talking about like plants that store various toxins, sunflowers, and micro, I think, mushrooms and algae and fungi and things like that. So are there anything like kind of, specific that you can think like would be relevant in the East Palestine context in that kind of direction?
Certainly, as the East Palestine situation unfolds, my concern for the future is recontamination of the surface water bodies as the teabag allows it to go out in the fall back into the creeks. There's going to be some of that. I'm more concerned with the soil vapor intrusion into the community, meaning that the chemicals continue to move in pockets under homes and throughout the community. That's usually what we see a whole lot more of in these types of spills. And so, which is why I'm calling for the, capture zone and let's start extracting massive amounts of groundwater and treating it. When it comes to the issue of plants, quite frankly, so a lot of the people in East Palestine are hooked up to city water for their homes and their showers and that type of stuff. That community drinking water system's safe, and it is purchasing the equipment to be prepared for the contamination should it arrive at their groundwater wells. So I'm not concerned with the drinking water in East Palestine. But half the people in town, and that's a hypothetical half, it's based on what I'm hearing, have old groundwater wells in their backyards that they use for outdoor irrigation, for their little home neighborhood farm, those types of activities. There's a lot of farmland as you get towards the Pennsylvania side where they still have groundwater wells. As soon as they produce that groundwater and spray it on irrigation on plants and things like that, the plant may uptake some of the remaining salts associated with that chemical contamination, but most of these chemicals that have found their way into the environment because of this rail spill are going to volatilize, meaning they're going to off gas into the air and the UV light's going to destroy them. So the remediation is that. Unfortunately, if the kid's swing set's next to the garden and you're running a sprinkler there, they're going to be, re-exposed in the air associated with that irrigation practice. So there is a lot of in situ remediation for spills using plants. I'm working on one right now with a Native American tribe in Maine for hemp actually uptakes PFAS, the perfluorinated contaminants, Teflon and Scotchgard. And so we're getting it into the hemp. The hemp has to be burned, but it's burned into, and I don't mean burned like the dioxin. It's put into a cast iron chamber. It's all controlled. It's it's basically heated at it's pyrolysis. It's not like burning and creating smoke. It actually heats. it turns it into ash inside of an iron chamber. So we're actually remediating the Scotch Guard and the Teflon using hemp because it sucks it up so much. But any of these volatiles, I don't see an opportunity to use those in East Palestine.
Okay, but I mean that's really interesting, right? Hemp and sunflower plants are, sort of garden variety like friends that we all know about, and they're also helpful for dealing with heavy duty toxic waste. That's cool.
Yeah, I
What
promised
else?
you I wouldn't. Yeah, I promise you I wouldn't get too technical, but here's what those types of plants do that others don't. So like carrots, potatoes, onions, you're okay, it's going into the leafy greens or the seeds in the sunflower. Any plant that produces high protein, the chemicals like to follow the protein chains, which is why they cause cancer, as opposed to the carbohydrate chains. So, you'll find it in the high protein plant producing chemical type systems. So alfalfa produces a ton of protein. I mean, it's people that eat meats. Basically, you're just getting all your protein from the alfalfa plant. It's just going through the animal that produces the meat. And butters and cheeses and milks and things like that, very, very high protein. They're getting that protein from that plant. And so that's why hemp, very high protein, alfalfa, very high protein, sunflower seeds are very high in protein. I hope I was able to communicate that. That's something you need to follow, when you start thinking of things like that.
So it's like they draw up the chemical because they use so much protein to make themselves that they capture it from the soil, and then I guess it just breaks down. Like what happens after that plant is
No, the plant has to be destroyed. You don't want to eat those, which is why I said then you put the hemp pyrolysis machine. So
right.
yeah, it does. It creates usable product. The black carbon and things like that can be used. If it's done properly, you can activate the hemp into carbon absorptive products, things like that. So, I mean, it's not a total throwaway. The quantity you'd need to do to get all the PFAS out of Maine, it's probably going to be hemp road based because there's just going to be so much ash left over.
Right. Okay. Wow. That's a totally new thing to think about. The waste product of treating toxic waste itself with plants and other mitigation techniques. Well, so in general, now that I mean it's just happened, it's a couple months since the spill in East Palestine, and as you said, it's a 10 out of 10. What's your gaze into the future? Do you think that it's going to continue to be a really serious thing, like the Leroy spill that you mentioned in 1970, or are there things that could be done if Norfolk Southern leads the way, for example, that could turn this from a 10 this year into maybe a 5 over the next couple of years?
Yes, they can. Well, even back to their 2, and what I mean by that is they're not being very direct. It's, how do I say, what I'm suspicious of in East Palestine. I don't know whether you followed the specifics of it or not. I didn't want to get into the huge stories about it, but there were a number of tracks parallel each other that were running through there. And when the train derailment set of tracks were removed from service, they excavated those and they put them on the other tracks. Now they're digging the whole area up. And so they are, in my opinion, over excavating. But I'm not sure it's for the chemicals that spilled during the derailment or the fact that that area of rail was so contaminated with diesel and gas. Have you heard all the diesel and gas? No, diesel and gas, really, contributed to this derailment. There was some diesel and gas fuel associated with the derailment. For the most part, though, it's just, if you've ever walked along train tracks as a kid, you smell the creosote, you smell the diesel, so that area was pretty contaminated already in that industrial part of town. So I'm not sure if every time they dig up a truckload of dirt, they're taking away the vinyl chloride, spill chemicals that are saturating the dirt, the other chemicals that are saturating the dirt, or just the fact that that section of rail was just so polluted, they're hauling it all away. We don't know. But what I don't see yet from anybody is that all you got to do is run around real quick, get a good map of where the existing wells are. They're putting in monitoring wells. Why aren't they putting in extraction wells? Monitoring wells are just going to tell you, yep, it got here. I want to put in extraction wells and start sucking out. If you're sucking out clean water, great. It's cheaper to clean water. But if you're not, you're cleaning up something. And so it's not going to be a wasted exercise. Create a huge cone of depression around that spill and run it for a year, 18 months, 24 months, however long it takes, so that area of contamination doesn't continue to migrate. Because of all the creeks that are associated. You got Sulphur Creek, you got all these different creeks that are going through the community, and they're all ultimately going down to the Ohio River, and the city's pumping water over there and industrial's pumping water. They don't know what's happening under the ground. Nobody's really looking at that. And if they are, they're not sharing it with anybody, because that's the quickest way to shut me up is just give me the information. But right now, I don't see a whole lot of stuff going on. Then, I'm the governor of Indiana, and they're not bringing that dirt here anymore. And they're not sending that stuff to Texas anymore. And, that's all the stuff that we're hearing now. Quite frankly, you spilled it in Ohio, clean it up in Ohio, and do it right. Don't just haul it somewhere else and make it somebody else's problem. And there are treatment technologies to accomplish that. I don't understand why we're dancing around the issues. It looks good on the 5 o'clock news. That's for sure. Or it doesn't.
So last kind of roundup thought, if you had the answers to all of these things that, you've mentioned, right, that there's data somewhere, but it hasn't been connected, and it's probably not connected to what everyone is doing either. But if that was to be solved somehow, would you be able to say, like, this is what should be done, here's the technologies, and this is the bill?
Yeah, I think it's relatively easy to do. I think they might, to be honest with you, I think they actually, if it comes down to dollars and cents, I think they've wasted more money that could have gone to real, actual cleanup, in the long run. Quite frankly, if I was the head of the railroad, I'd be calling for an audit on where all this nonsense has gone on. And I'd be calling my consulting engineering firms in and saying, hey, the buck stops here, buddy. What are you doing? What have you done for me lately? And, really looking at this long and hard. I don't think they need to spend $1 more than they've already spent. You know what it must cost to haul a truckload of dirt to Texas?
Yeah,
I could clean up a lot of local groundwater for that,
Right. Interesting. So really, it seems that the number one problem that you're seeing here is it's knowledge and information and communication.
Right. It's amazing. I can't say it enough or overemphasize it. And this may or may not make a whole lot of sense to you, but like I'm more of a safe drinking water act guy, community drinking water system stuff. And Aaron and I, we got 500 different people calling us about, or 500, we got 500,000 people calling us about different stuff. But it's usually right around 250 chemicals of concern. I got PFAS in my water. I got lead in my water. I got Chrom-6 in my water. What are you going to do about it? And I said, Aaron, we can't be everyone's everything. We've got to focus, or we're going to just die accomplishing nothing. So we decided to focus on one of the easiest original contaminants in drinking water, total organic carbon. And that's decaying leaves and grasses and, organic carbon. It's very low in groundwater, very high in surface waters. I understand your guest yesterday was from Cincinnati. City of Cincinnati has been treating the drinking water off the Ohio River very well. They're one of my favorite drinking water systems in this entire world, not just country. Cincinnati is one of those utilities that does it right. They're the only drinking water utility in North America that actually has a granular activated carbon reactivation facility at the water treatment plant. Only one in the country. And it's like, because they went all in. They said, we're tired of the Ohio River being dirty. We're going to do it right. And they do it right. But where I was going with this is Aaron and I said, let's just take out total organic carbon. And the way total organic carbon works is if you have 5 milligrams per liter, you have to reduce it to 3. If you have 10, you have to reduce it to 6. You have to have this percentage of reduction, which I think is stupid, because you either take the dirt out of the drinking water or you don't take the dirt out of the drinking water. I have a national challenge out there right now to any drinking water utility that properly reports in their annual consumer confidence report total organic carbon reduction. out of 57,000 drinking water utilities in North America, I haven't found one that does it right. And it's because the EPA doesn't communicate to the states don't communicate to the drinking water utilities or to the regions, and it just goes ignored. And so it's those kinds of things that are so frustrating. We have the technology, we have the rules, we have the regulations, we have the knowledge, we have the people. Let's get on with it.
Right. We just need to put it all together and bake a cake.
Right. Right. Or the consumer is going to become the regulator. And I will tell you that a pissed off mom at a microphone at a city council meeting is a pretty powerful tool.
Stand with Aaron Brockovich, Jess Conard, Tom Bevan, and the local community by visiting www.eastpalestinejustice.com. The environmental and human trauma incurred from this train derailment requires appropriate restitution. Get ready to groove, learn, and celebrate with DJ J-Kind and other artists at the Restorative Rave on June 17th. Let's make some noise for a greener future to complete the Ohio River Valley Restore-A-Thon. More details coming soon.
So what exactly is a bioregion? What is a watershed, and how do those two connect to each other?
So a bioregion is really a collection of plants or an ecosystem that is made up based on the parameters and limitations of the rainfall, climate, and soils. And all those factors come together to create conditions for specific species to thrive and survive and thrive.
So is the overall ecosystem there, is it healthy, or are there pressures already before the derailment happened from agriculture or invasive species or pollution of any kind?
Yeah, all those things have been playing a factor for a long time. Ohio was, I've been thinking about it, it was sort of the Silicon Valley of the early 1900s. There was a lot of industry, there was a lot of money, there was a lot of activity of industrialization going on. And this region has a long legacy of cleanup from that era. There's actually a good movie that came out just a couple years ago called Dark Waters, which had Mark Ruffalo in it, and it tracked the story of a Cincinnati lawyer fighting a cover-up. I believe it was from DuPont, which it was actually in West Virginia, just right across the river, and a little bit up the river from Cincinnati, closer to East Palestine. And this lawyer who lives in Cincinnati, who Mark Ruffalo plays, he's still here, the lawyer, and had to dig up and fight this big battle against DuPont and won, which the movie tells that whole story. It's a great movie. So, you really see the impacts on the ecosystem, which was, really pillaged for, a good 150 years. And the restoration of it is the challenge. And now that we have ecological science, and I argue with permaculture and things like regenerative agriculture, how do we actually learn to farm these lands in a way that is restorative and healing?
So what can we do to support those processes? It's fantastic that there's water to just kind of naturally do it, but what kind of remediation and other, sorts of investments or solutions can we bring to support that breakdown and the general sort of thriving and restoration of the bioregion at large?
So having taught permaculture here for the last 15 years, that's been a large discussion because our cities are fairly polluted, especially with lead. Lead is a very big concern, which, there's chemicals that will break down and then heavy metals will never break down. And those are the ones that really need to be sequestered over time. And there are techniques like phytoremediation or mycoremediation that can help break down those chemicals. One example of that is I've heard that sunflowers will pull lead up into its body as it grows. And about the first foot or two of a sunflower will sequester the lead, but then you have to take the plant out of there and bring it to a landfill because the lead won't break down. So
are there particular projects happening now to kind of think through the remediation needs of the East Palestine spill, or in general, are there projects that are happening that could be augmented to support that?
Yeah, and I think that the challenge of the East Palestine spill is that it's so large and it's in a town. And so these chemicals have found their ways all over every constructed surface, and especially from the smoke. And, where the train initially wrecked, obviously, typical brownfield remediation, they dig the dirt up and bring it to a landfill somewhere. Now, when it comes to cleaning up of homes, that's a whole nother story. And I would be concerned, I almost, having lived in the Midwest and seen, a lot of deindustrialization where homes go vacant, are eventually boarded up and bulldozed. And those homes can have lots of different chemicals, and heavy metals, especially with lead paint and things like that. You almost have to, I sort of wonder how many homes will eventually get bulldozed, whether they're reclaimable or not, and how much of that town, having been, covered in these chemicals, especially the hard surfaces. The soils is where you could do the phytoremediation. The hard surfaces would be a whole nother story. And the watershed, it could continue to leach into the watershed depending, on a lot of environmental factors, or it could, because it's mostly on the surface, could flush out through several heavy rains over a period of time, which I know locally here, our water, the Cincinnati Water District, they pull a lot of water from a ground aquifer, but also from the Ohio River, which is in the watershed of the East Palestine spill. And they were tracking the chemicals coming down the river, and they shut down the intakes for the city water when that chemical spill came down.
Do you or someone you know have a sailboat in the Ohio River Valley? We'd like to team build from the river itself. Please contact restore.a.thon at gmail.com to hook us up with a local captain. We need your help to execute these community-driven solutions. Visit restore-a-thon.com/donate and please contribute whatever you can.